Proclamation. The Proclamation of 1763 defined a boundary called the Proclamation Line at the western edge of the settler colonies controlled by Britain. The Proclamation declared territory west of the boundary Indian Territory, and it defined rules for expansion of settlement into this First Nations territory. It also made Britain the intermediary between First Nations and the colonies. The World Proclamation introduced three important principles. It required that treaties be made with First Nations in order to acquire land for settlement. It positioned the Crown in a kind of mediating role between First Nations and Europeans, and it declared that there was a special relationship between the Crown and First Nations. The B&A Act transferred these principles to the Canadian government. The Act also defined federal and provincial jurisdictions with matters concerning First Nations people made federal responsibilities.
The Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 advocated gradually removing all legal distinction between First Nations people and other Canadians. The government, through eliminating the legal distinction, would abolish First Nations' traditional way of life and lead First Nations into mainstream economy. At the same time, the Act created a legal distinction by defining the term Indian. Its definition included only those people living on reserves or on unceded lands. Legislation and policy aimed at civilizing First Nations people and demonstrated a clear cultural bias on the part of the government officials. Europeans did not conceive of their culture as having worldview, nor did they recognize that First Nations had their own cultures and worldviews. The Gradual Enfranchisement Act established criteria for judging First Nations men suitable for enfranchisement. Only men could be enfranchised. First Nations women could only be enfranchised if their husbands were, but could not vote. The Act tried to make First Nations people value private property by awarding plots of reserve land to enfranchised individuals. Enfranchised people could not sell their plots nor pass them down to their children. Between the enactment of the Gradual Civilization Act and the Indian Enfranchisement Act, Canada became a nation. Until 1867, Britain had governed Canada as 4 separate colonies: Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The British North American, or the B&A Act, united the colonies in a federation and described the rules under which this federation would govern itself. Canada became a dominion with the British Empire, which meant it retained links to the British Crown. Britain, however, no longer directly controlled Canada's affairs. Section 91 of the B&A Act transferred the relationship of the British government that the British government had established with the First Nations people to the Canadian government. It did this without consulting First Nations. The transfer set out in the B&A Act meant that the new Canadian federal government essentially assumed the role of the British Crown as defined in the proclamation.
Indian Enfranchisement Act. Under the Indian Enfranchisement Act of 1867, also called the Gradual Enfranchisement Act, Canada's government added more ways to control the lives of First Nations people. Like the Gradual Civilization Act, this act continued to interfere with traditional collective land holdings. In other words, it pushed First Nations people to adopt European-style individual ownership of property, which conflicted with traditional concepts of collective claims to territory. It also sometimes forced First Nations people to live on reserved land that did not fall within their traditional territory, or it did not allow traditional kinship groups to live together.
The Indian Act was first passed in 1876 as a consolidation of various laws concerning Indigenous people enacted by separate colonies of British North America prior to Canadian Confederation, most notably the Gradual Civilization Act passed by Upper Canada Legislature in 1857, and the Gradual Enfranchisement Act.
The Indian Act was passed by Parliament of Canada under the provisions of Section 91 of the Constitution Act 1867, which provides Canada's federal government exclusive authority to govern in relation to Indians and lands reserved for Indians. It was an attempt to codify rights promised to Native peoples in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, while at the same time enforcing Euro-Canadian standards of civilization. The purpose of the act was to administer Indian affairs in such a way that Indian people would feel compelled to renounce their Indian status and join Canadian civilization as full members, a process called enfranchisement.
Law governing First Nations people and their descendants that signed treaties who were otherwise registered in the Act's provision, encompassing the governance of reserves and the rights and the benefits of registered individuals, first passed in 1876 and amended in many times since. The Act designates federal government obligations towards registered individuals and regulates the management of reserved lands.
Red and White Paper. In 1970, the Indian Association of Alberta issued a detailed written attack on the Trudeau government's White Paper. They called their paper Citizens Plus, but everyone soon began calling it the Red Paper. The Red Paper examined and refuted the White Paper's main conclusion one by one. Alberta First Nations leader Harold Cardinal and other leaders presented the Red Paper directly to Trudeau's cabinet in 1971. Trudeau admitted that the White Paper might be naive and formally withdrew it.
Bill C-31. The events that led to Bill C-31 were set in motion in 1970 when a First Nations woman challenged a controversial section of the Indian Act. Under Bill C-31, marriage no longer affected a person's Indian status. Status Indian women could no longer lose their status by marrying non-status men, and likewise non-status women could no longer gain Indian status by marrying status men. Bill C-31 put an end to enfranchisement. In the past, people could lose their status if, for example, they served in the armed forces, wanted to vote, obtained a university degree, or wanted to own private property. Under Bill C-31, people who unfairly lost their status through enfranchisement could apply to have their Indian status reinstated. This included women who were stripped of their status by marrying non-status men.
Children of people who were reinstated as status Indians could also apply for status. In some cases, the rule also applied to grandchildren. Children would also be treated equally, whether natural or adopted or born out of wedlock. First Nation bands are given the option of their taking control of their own membership. Lists are leaving control in the hands of the government. Those who took over their lists could grant membership to non-status Indians or, in certain cases, refuse membership to status Indians, in effect that gave bands the power to deny membership to people who resign status if they also despair. Bands were also given power to enact their own bylaws to control who would live in their reserves and who could receive treaty rights.